The wind rolled over the dry plains like a tired breath from the earth, carrying dust, whispers, and the faint echo of something broken. On the far edge of Red Canyon Valley stood a small adobe house, worn by storms and years of quiet struggle. That house belonged to a widow named Leora, a woman known for her strong heart, her steady hands, and her refusal to let loneliness turn her cold. Folks said she carried the old American spirit in her bones, the kind that kept frontier women standing tall even when the world around them felt too heavy to bear. Leora had buried her husband 2 winters earlier, after a sickness swept through the settlement and took him before she could grasp what was happening. Life since then had been a long road of empty chores, quiet meals, and nights where she kept a lamp burning only to convince herself she was not swallowed by the dark. She lived with kindness, though always offering a warm drink or a place by the fire to any traveler in need. But nobody knew how much she longed for a voice inside her home again, something small and gentle that reminded her. Why she kept going? The day everything changed was the day she found the girl. It was early morning when Leora stepped outside to draw water from the well. The sunrise painted the horizon with soft gold, and the fields stretched into miles of silence. As she reached for the rope, she heard a slight rustle behind the old corral. She thought it might be a fox, maybe a stray calf. But then she heard breathing, slow and shaky, like it belonged to someone who had run too far. Leora moved closer, her boots pressing into the dry earth. She stopped at the corner of the corral, and there, half hidden behind a broken plank, stood a small Apache girl with tangled hair and frightened eyes. Dirt covered her skin, her clothes were torn, and her feet were bruised from walking without rest. She looked no older than 8, but her eyes carried a weight far beyond her years. Leora raised her hands gently and spoke in a calm voice, trying not to frighten her. The girl didn't move. She kept staring, ready to run if the widow made one wrong step. Leora asked if she was hungry, and the child's lips trembled before she nodded. That silent nod told Leora everything she needed to know. Danger must have chased this child far from her people. She had nowhere else to go. Inside the warm adobe kitchen, the small girl ate as if she had not touched food in days. She held the bread with both hands, shoulders shaking from exhaustion. Leora watched her quietly, her heart folding around the girl with a strange protectiveness she had not felt in years. She gave her water, a blanket, and a chair near the fire. When she asked her name, the girl whispered it so softly, Leora barely heard it. It sounded like Desra. There was something strong in the child, something proud. Even in fear, her posture held an echo of courage. Leora knew Apache children carried the spirit of their warriors, taught from birth to survive the harsh lands and harsh times. But this girl was alone, and her loneliness tugged at the widow until she felt it inside her own bones. Leora told her she could stay, till she felt safe. She didn't think twice. She didn't ask where the girl came from. She didn't worry what trouble she might bring. She only knew that no child deserved to wander the frontier helpless. News spread fast through Red Canyon Valley. Some settlers raised eyebrows, whispering that taking in an Apache girl could bring unwanted attention. Others warned that warriors often searched for their own with fierce loyalty. But Leora didn't waver. She believed kindness didn't need permission, and she was willing to carry whatever came with it. Days passed. Desra began to soften. She followed Leora around the house like a quiet shadow, learning chores, fetching water, sweeping dust from the doorway. She slept curled near the fire, as if she didn't believe she was truly allowed a bed yet. At night she woke crying, whispering words in her language that Leora couldn't understand. Something haunted her, something from before she reached the widow's land. Leora held her hand until her breathing steadied. As the bond grew stronger, Leora started to feel the house come alive again. The silence was no longer empty. The laughter that returned to her home was soft. But it was enough to light something inside her. But out on the plains, whispers traveled farther than footsteps. Riders spoke of an Apache warrior whose name made even hardened men stiffen. A tall, fierce man known to settlers as Ironcrest. They said he walked like a mountain with fire in his eyes, a man whose presence could silence a crowd. Some described him as unstoppable. Some said he fought with loyalty stronger than steel. And some said he was searching for something or someone with a rage that made the desert seem colder. Rumors drifted into Red Canyon Valley, landing on Leora's porch like unwelcome wind. They said Ironcrest had lost a child. They said he would stop at nothing to find her. They said he would cross every boundary of land to bring her back. Leora didn't pay attention at first. Many stories about Apache warriors were stretched by fear, twisted, until truth got lost in them. But the girl grew jumpy whenever riders passed near the house. She listened to the wind as if expecting a voice in it. She watched the horizon more than any child should. One evening, while Leora milked the goat near the stable, Desra walked to her side and tugged gently on her clothes. Her eyes were filled with something that looked too old for her small face. She placed a hand over her heart and murmured a single word. It carried a sound that made Leora pause. She didn't understand the meaning, but she felt the weight behind it. It was a name. Leora brushed the girl's hair and smiled softly, unaware that this name belonged to the most feared warrior the frontier had ever spoken of. Unaware that by opening her door to this lost child, she had stepped into a storm she didn't see coming. That night the sky rattled with distant thunder, even though the land stayed dry. Leora closed the shutters, tucked Desra into her blanket, and told her she was safe here. But the girl stared at the door long after the lantern went out, as if she knew the world outside was shifting. At dawn, everything felt unsettled. The air carried a strange tension. Horses far away cried out as if sensing something powerful approaching. Leora stepped outside to feed the chickens, and for a moment she froze. A single footprint marked the dirt near her fence. Larger than any she had seen, deep, heavy, a warrior's print. She followed the trail with her eyes, and saw it led toward the open plains, then disappeared among the rocks. Her heart tightened. She went inside slowly, closing the door with a trembling hand. When she looked at Desra, the girl was already standing, eyes wide. As if she felt the same shift in the wind, and far beyond the valley, a towering figure stepped onto the ridge. Watching the small adobe house where his daughter now lived, he was closer than anyone knew, and he was coming. The wind felt sharper the next morning, carrying a strange tension that settled over the widow's home like a thin veil. Leora tried to focus on her chores, but her mind kept circling back to that single footprint. It had been no ordinary mark. She had lived long enough on the frontier to recognize the steps of traders, ranchers, soldiers, and drifters. This one was different. Deep, steady, left by someone who carried both strength and purpose. Someone who had come too close to her home without knocking or calling out. Someone who had been watching. Inside the adobe house, Desra moved with unusual quietness. She clung to the blanket wrapped around her small shoulders. Watching Leora with eyes full of questions, she never spoke aloud. Leora knew the girl sensed the shift in the air. Children who lived through hardship carried instincts sharper than most adults. They learned to feel danger long before it showed its face. Leora knelt beside her and tried to smile, brushing the girl's hair with gentle fingers. She told Desra everything was fine, that footprints on a frontier road didn't mean harm. But the girl didn't seem comforted. She looked toward the window, as if expecting someone to appear there at any moment. Her small body went tense at every sound, whether it was the creak of wood or the call of a distant hawk. As the sun began to rise higher, Leora stepped outside and scanned the horizon. Red Canyon Valley stretched far and wide, dotted with shrubs, pale sand, and distant rock towers carved by time. She had always loved this place. It was harsh but honest, quiet but full of hidden stories. Now it felt different, as if the land held its breath, as if something old and powerful had awakened. Travelers passing by the settlement brought more whispers. They spoke of an Apache warrior moving across the land with unmatched speed, a man whose presence turned even brave riders cautious. They said he was following a trail. They said he carried a fury inside him. They said he searched for something precious that had been taken from him. Some swore his name was Ironcrest. Leora had heard the name before. It traveled through campfire talk, in stories shared by soldiers and traders who crossed Apache lands. They spoke of him with both fear and respect. He was a guardian of his people, a fierce protector, a warrior who carried loyalty like a badge carved into his soul. But he was also known for his temper when someone threatened what he loved. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of such a man, and no one wanted to stand between him and whatever he was searching for. Still, Leora didn't want to believe the footprint belonged to him. She didn't want to imagine such a man lurking near her home, and she certainly didn't want to think her tender, quiet Desra could be the one he sought. The idea felt too heavy, too dangerous. She tried to push it aside, focusing on her tasks. She cleaned the tools near the shed, checked the small vegetable patch, and repaired the loose latch on the chicken coop. But every movement held a strain. Every sound made her glance over her shoulder. Later that afternoon, while gathering herbs near the fence, she noticed Desra sitting on the ground with a small wooden carving she had found on the property months ago. It was a tiny figure shaped like a bird, its wings spread as if caught in flight. Leora had once assumed it belonged to a trader or rancher who passed through. But Desra held it as if it meant far more. The girl traced the carving with her fingers, whispering a soft word with each touch. Leora didn't recognize the language, but she felt the weight of it. Desra repeated it over and over, not like a chant, but like a memory she was trying to keep alive. Leora sat beside her. She asked gently where the carving had come from. Desra didn't answer with words. She simply placed the carving against her heart and closed her eyes. A quiet tremble ran through her body. It was then Leora realized the carving wasn't just a toy. It was something deep, something tied to the child's past. Something that carried the shape of a life she had lost far too soon at night. When the sky turned navy blue and the coyotes began their calls, Leora stayed awake by the window. She kept a lantern burning, though she knew it made her house easier to see from the plains. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there was watching that small flame, waiting, judging, whether to approach or keep the distance. The next morning brought more unease. A rider from the settlement passed by to trade supplies, and he brought new stories. He said Ironcrest had been seen near the northern ridge, that he questioned travelers with a voice that could silence the wind, that he asked about a missing child and carried. It's a look of a man willing to tear mountains apart to find her. Leora tried to remain calm, but her hands shook slightly as she accepted the supplies. The rider looked past her toward the adobe doorway, where Desra sat quietly watching them. She saw the way the man hesitated, the way his eyes lingered on the girl's features as if something about her stirred a memory. Leora quickly stepped in front of Desra, offering the rider a polite but firm farewell. She didn't want rumors reaching Ironcrest's ears. She didn't want anyone drawing attention to the child, but rumors had a way of traveling where they weren't invited. Days later, strange signs began appearing around her land. A feather tied to a branch, a stone placed carefully at the corner of her path, tracks in the dirt that came close to her home but never crossed her fence line. They were too deliberate to be accidents, too symbolic to be random. Leora recognized them as messages. Not spoken, not written, but left by someone who wanted her to know he was near. Desra noticed them too. Each time she saw a sign, she clutched the carving to her chest and pressed her forehead against Leora's arm, trembling with a mix of fear and longing. The widow didn't understand the child's reactions, but she felt the weight of them deep in her heart. One evening, Leora decided to take Desra for a walk near the canyon edge, hoping fresh air might ease her fear. The sun dropped behind the cliffs, painting the world in copper and rose. The land felt both beautiful and unsettling. As they walked, Desra picked wildflowers and held them gently, as if trying to hold on to something soft in a world too rough. Then, as they neared a rocky outcrop, Leora noticed something that made her stop. A handprint on a stone, large, strong, painted with old clay, a mark used by Apache warriors when sending warnings or invitations. Leora stared at it, feeling her heartbeat rise like thunder. Desra stepped forward, touching the handprint with trembling fingers. Her small palm barely filled half of it. She whispered the same name she had spoken before, the name she held close like a secret. Leora still didn't understand its meaning. She felt the truth of it pressing closer. When night fell, the wind carried a distant sound. Hooves, slow, steady, moving with purpose across the land. Leora hurried inside, securing the door as Desra hid behind her. She held the girl close, whispering reassurance she didn't fully believe. The hooves grew louder, then stopped somewhere near the ridge. Silence followed, heavy and watchful. In that silence, the truth became unavoidable. Whoever searched for Desra was close. Whoever left the signs wanted her back. And whoever had been watching the adobe home these past days wasn't just a traveler passing through. A powerful warrior was drawing near. A father whose blood ran through the small girl trembling in Leora's arms. The widow didn't yet know how far Ironcrest would go to reclaim what was his. She didn't know the storm waiting beyond the ridge. She only knew that the peaceful days she once lived were drifting out of reach, replaced by a shadow growing larger with every heartbeat, and the land itself felt like it was bracing for what would come next. The following evening settled over Red Canyon Valley with a heavy stillness. As if the sky itself was waiting for something to break, Leora kept Desra close while she lit the lamps inside the adobe house, though her fingers trembled slightly each time the flame rose. She tried not to let the girl see her fear, but Desra sensed it anyway. Children who had survived storms learned to read silence better than spoken words. Outside, the plains stretched into shadows. The wind carried the faint scent of horses, the kind used by warriors who traveled without rest. Leora had heard hoofbeats earlier that afternoon, too slow to be a herd, too controlled to belong to passing ranchers. Whoever had ridden past was watching her land with a purpose. She felt it in her bones. Inside the small kitchen, Desra sat carving lines into a piece of driftwood with a tiny stone. She moved her hands with a strange calm, shaping the wood into something with wings. Leora watched her for a moment. That carving was more than a toy. Every movement carried memory, culture, and pain. She wondered who had taught her. A father, a mother, someone who filled her world before she arrived at this lonely doorstep. The peace inside the home didn't last long. A sudden knock echoed against the wooden door. Leora's breath caught. Desra froze, the carving falling from her hands. The knock came again, firmer this time. When Leora opened the door a crack, she saw a man from the settlement. His horse stood behind him, restless and stamping at the dirt. The man looked uneasy, glancing over his shoulder as if something unseen lurked in the dark. He said he came to warn her. Riders had spotted an Apache warrior near the northern ridge, tall, silent, armed, a man with painted braids and a presence strong enough to shake even seasoned frontiersmen. He didn't say the name, but Leora didn't need to hear it. She closed the door after he left and leaned against it, her breath shallow. Desra stood a few steps away, clutching the driftwood carving again. She didn't speak, but her trembling hands revealed everything. She knew exactly who the warrior was. She had known long before Leora allowed herself to believe it. That night sleep didn't come easily. Leora lay awake listening to the creaks of the house, the distant cries of coyotes, and the occasional whistle of wind through the cracks. And beneath all of that, she felt an unseen gaze pressing against the adobe walls. She didn't know how long she stayed awake before drifting into a thin sleep. But she woke before dawn to the sound of footsteps outside. She rushed to the doorway and found nothing but footprints leading toward the stable. Large, powerful steps. She followed them with shaking hands, stopping at the fence when she saw a feather tied to the top rail. Black and white. Smooth. Carefully placed. A sign not of violence, but of presence. Someone had stood outside her home in the dark. Someone close enough to touch her walls. Someone who chose not to enter. The next days brought growing tension. Leora tried to keep the child safe, but Desra's fear deepened. She began waking before sunrise, staring out the window at the empty plains, as if waiting for a figure only she could sense. She barely spoke, and when she tried to sleep, she clutched the small carving until her knuckles turned pale. Meanwhile, news from the settlement grew worse. Ranchers claimed they had seen Ironcrest pass near their lands. Soldiers said he never attacked but watched them from afar with eyes full of purpose. One man swore he saw him kneeling in the dust, tracing shapes into the earth before wiping them away with his hand. Another said he carried a piece of cloth with him, folded gently against his chest. Leora felt the truth tightening around her. She wasn't harboring any lost Apache child. She was protecting the daughter of a warrior whose loyalty ran as deep as blood. A father whose heart had been broken. A man who would cross fire to reclaim what belonged to him. The conflict grew heavier when a group of settlers arrived at Leora's porch one afternoon. 3 men carrying rifles more for fear than necessity. They said they came to talk. They said they respected Leora, but were worried about the danger her choice had brought to their community. They didn't want Apache warriors near their land. They didn't want to risk an uprising. They urged her to send the girl away to a mission settlement farther west where she would be kept under supervision. Their voices were steady. Leora felt a fire rise inside her as she stepped between them and the door. She told them Desra wasn't a threat. She told them fear should never decide the fate of a child. But they didn't listen. They kept insisting, their tone rising with each word, till Desra appeared behind Leora, peeking out with wide eyes. The men looked at the girl's face. Her features told the story they didn't want to accept. One of them muttered that Leora was protecting the wrong child. Before anything could escalate, Leora stepped forward, standing tall, despite the tremble in her heart, and demanded they leave her land. After they rode away, Leora locked the door and sank to her knees. She couldn't protect Desra from every angle. Not from the settlers. Not from soldiers. Not from the warrior who searched the valley. And not from whatever history the girl carried in her silence as Leora held her. Desra whispered something she had never said before. She murmured a name. A strong name filled with weight and emotion. Leora felt her heart twist. She finally understood who the warrior was. She finally understood the bond between father and daughter, but that only made the conflict heavier. The next morning brought new tension. A soldier from the nearby fort arrived, dusty and exhausted from riding long hours. He warned Leora that Ironcrest had been spotted less than a mile away. He carried no weapons raised, but he moved with determination. The fort was preparing to confront him. They feared he might attack the settlement. They feared he might try to take the girl by force. Leora felt the soldier's words strike her like cold rain. She tried to explain that the warrior did not seem to want war, but the soldier shook his head. Fear was louder than reason in these lands, and fear was harder to fight than steel. When the soldier left, Leora turned to Desra. The girl stood near the doorway, clutching the wooden carving and staring into the open land. Her eyes didn't hold fear alone. There was something stronger beneath it. A longing. A recognition. A connection that could not be broken by distance or silence. Leora's heart ached. She had grown to love the child. She had built her days around protecting her, but now the truth pressed against her chest. She wasn't the only one who loved Desra, and she wasn't the only one who had a claim over her. Late that afternoon, Leora took Desra to the riverbank, hoping to clear her thoughts. The water shimmered beneath the sunlight, carrying reflections of the sky across the slow current. Desra dipped her toes in the cool stream and let the driftwood bird float on the surface. The carving drifted until it caught on a rock near the middle of the river. Desra whispered to the river for the first time. Her voice sounded stronger than a frightened child's. It sounded like someone who remembered where she belonged. Leora sat beside her, touched her shoulder gently, and felt something shift between them. A truth neither dared to say out loud. That night, when the moon rose over the plains, Leora woke to the sound of a distant drumbeat, soft, slow, pulsing like a heartbeat carried through the land. Desra sat up too, eyes wide, recognizing the rhythm instantly. She moved to the window with trembling hands and stared into the night, far away. On a ridge lit by silver moonlight, a figure stood tall against the sky. His outline was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, braided hair, a warrior's stance that held centuries of strength. Iron crest. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching the small adobe home where his daughter slept. His presence filled the night with a power that made the air grow still. Leora felt her breath break in her chest. She knew the moment she had feared was drawing near. The main conflict was no longer a rumor. It was standing on the ridge. It was watching her. It was waiting. And the land, the sky, every shadow in the valley seemed to brace for the storm that was about to fall. The moon hung low over Red Canyon Valley, washing the land in silver light that made every rock, every fence post, every distant shadow feel sharper than before. Leora stood by the window with her hands pressed to the wooden frame, watching the tall figure on the ridge. Ironcrest didn't move. He stood like a carved statue, silent, powerful, and rooted in the land as if the earth itself held him upright. Even from a distance, his presence felt heavy, like a storm cloud waiting for the right moment to break. Behind her, Desra whispered his name again, the same name she had whispered in her sleep for weeks. Her voice carried a mix of fear and longing, as if part of her heart recognized the warrior in the moonlight. Leora knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. The small girl leaned into her but kept her eyes fixed on the ridge. The wooden carving clutched tightly in her hand. The air grew colder. The wind stilled. The plains felt like they were listening. Ironcrest finally stepped backward, fading into the night until nothing remained but the glitter of moonlight on the empty ridge. Leora pulled Desra close, her heart beating faster than she wanted to show. She had expected him to come storming down, demanding answers. Instead, he watched. He waited, and that frightened her more. A warrior who rushed into conflict could be reasoned with. A warrior who waited, who studied, who planned silently, was far more unpredictable. Sleep refused to come that night. Leora lay awake, listening to Desra's slow breathing beside her. Every sound outside felt sharper than usual. Every crack of the house felt like a warning. The weight of being caught between a desperate father and a frightened community pressed against her chest. She had made a promise to protect Desra, but the deeper truth grew harder to ignore. This child belonged to a world she did not fully understand, and the one searching for her wasn't a threat by nature. He was a father. The sun rose with a weak glow, barely warming the air. Leora took Desra outside to gather water, hoping fresh daylight might ease the tension inside the house. But as she stepped into the yard, she froze. Lying against the fence post was a long feather, darker than the one she had found before. Beneath it lay a small stone, shaped like a heart. Both were placed carefully, not thrown or dropped. A sign, a message, a request for peace, or a warning she couldn't yet interpret. Desra saw it too. She walked toward the fence slowly, her hand trembling. She touched the feather and whispered the same name again, but this time her voice cracked. Leora felt a sting behind her eyes. She understood then that Desra wasn't only afraid. She was torn. Her heart was reaching in two different directions, and Leora couldn't take one side without hurting the other. Later that afternoon, a group of settlers gathered near the outer well. Their voices rose louder than usual, filled with panic. Leora approached cautiously, keeping Desra behind her. One man claimed he saw Ironcrest riding near the old mill. Another swore he found tracks leading toward the settlement itself. A woman insisted she heard the sound of a drum in the middle of the night, as if a tribe was signaling from the hills. Fear twisted their faces. They wanted action. They wanted the fort to step in. They wanted the Apache warrior gone. When they noticed Leora standing near the edge of the group, the shouting quieted. A few of them exchanged uneasy glances. One man stepped forward and asked the question they had all been avoiding. Was the child Ironcrest's? Leora tightened her grip on Desra's shoulder. She didn't answer. She couldn't lie, but she wasn't ready to confirm what she herself was still trying to understand. Her silence said enough. The group murmured among themselves, voices rising again, fear spreading through them like dry grass catching flame. Leora didn't wait for their anger to turn into action. She led Desra away, feeling eyes burn into her back. She knew the settlers weren't cruel by nature. They were scared. Fear made people unpredictable. Fear made good people take desperate steps. When they reached home, Leora pushed the door closed and leaned against it. Desra pressed close to her, sensing the tension growing stronger around them. Leora wanted to cry, but she swallowed the feeling. She couldn't break now. She needed strength, steady hands, and a calm heart. She had weathered storms before. She would weather this too. That night, the sky grew darker than usual. Heavy clouds gathered over the plains, hiding the stars. A storm threatened, but didn't break. Leora sat by the fire with Desra in her lap, humming softly, trying to calm them both. The little girl clutched her carving and rested her head against Leora's chest. But then a faint sound reached their ears. Drum beat, slow, steady, echoing through the valley like a call from another. Whirled, Desra sat up, eyes wide. Leora froze. The drumbeat grew louder, as if carried by the wind, though no breeze was blowing. Then it stopped suddenly, leaving a hollow silence behind. Moments later, there was a soft knock at the door. Not forceful, not rushed. A single knock, as if giving her the choice to answer. Leora stood, her legs shaking. She walked to the door and opened it a few inches. A lone figure stood outside. Not Ironcrest. Not a settler. A young Apache woman, wrapped in a woven blanket, her dark braids falling over her shoulders. Her expression carried sorrow and urgency. She spoke softly in her language, words Leora could not understand. But she held out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Leora hesitated before taking it. Inside was a leather pendant shaped like a bird, with wings outstretched. Matching the carving Desra kept close to her heart. A symbol, a connection. Proof, the woman placed a hand over her own heart, then pointed to Desra inside the house. Tears glistened in her eyes. She whispered a single word, a word Leora recognized from Desra's fearful whispers. The same name? The same cry from her nightmares. Ironcrest. The woman stepped backward, bowing her head respectfully, then turned and disappeared into the darkness without another word. Leora stood frozen with the pendant in her hands, her heart hammering. She looked back at Desra, who had risen from the chair and was slowly walking toward her. The girl reached out and touched the pendant gently, her eyes filled with tears. Leora knelt beside her, feeling the truth tighten around them. Desra wasn't just the daughter of a warrior. She was part of a family searching desperately for her. A tribe that mourned her absence. A father who stood on ridges and watched her from afar. Torn between reclaiming her and respecting the widow who sheltered her. The tension grew thicker each hour. The settlers prepared themselves, ready for a confrontation they didn't fully understand. The fort sent riders to patrol the edges of the valley, and Ironcrest grew bolder. His tracks came closer. His signs became clearer. He was no longer hiding on distant ridges. He was circling the widow's land with silent determination, getting closer each night. Leora felt the storm building. Something was going to break soon. Something would force her to choose between love and fear. Between safety and truth. The night before everything would come to a head, Leora walked outside after Desra fell asleep. The plains were dark, the sky heavy. She stood by the fence where the feathers had been left and stared into the shadows, her heart full of questions with no answers. Faint rustle reached her ears. She turned. Ironcrest stepped forward from behind a cluster of rocks, his tall frame emerging from the darkness like a spirit made of earth and smoke. His presence filled the air, powerful and silent. His eyes flickered with pain and longing, but also with a steady fire that told her he would not leave without the truth. Leora felt frozen in place. Her breath caught. The warrior took a single step closer. His gaze locked with hers, and for the first time, she saw not the legend settlers feared, but a father trembling under the weight of loss. The tension between them grew thick enough to feel in the wind. He lifted his hands slowly, palm open, not in threat, but in plea, and the entire valley felt like it held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Lies stood frozen beneath the dim moonlight, staring at Ironcrest's open hand. The ridge behind him was quiet, the wind holding itself still as if the whole valley waited for her next move. For weeks she had feared the moment he would stand before her, and now that he was only a few steps away, she felt something unexpected rising inside her. Not fear, not anger, something gentler. Something that understood the weight of a parent's heart Desra's soft footsteps whispered behind her. The child stepped outside, clutching the small bird carving to her chest. The moment Ironcrest saw her, his entire body shifted. The warrior who had seemed carved from stone softened. His strong shoulders lowered. His eyes, fierce as the desert sun, brightened with emotion. He whispered the girl's name with a trembling voice, as if saying it too loudly might break the moment. Desra didn't run toward him at first. Instead, she walked slowly, her small hands slipping into Leora's for courage. She looked back and forth between the widow and the warrior, torn between the two worlds that had shaped her heart. Leora knelt beside her and brushed her cheek gently. She told her that family didn't have to be lost forever. She told her the warrior was her father and had crossed land, fear, and danger just to find her. And she told her she was safe. Hearing those words seemed to unlock the child's heart. Desra began to cry softly, the carving shaking in her hands. Leora gave her a gentle nod. Desra let go of her hand and walked toward Ironcrest. The warrior dropped to his knees, arms open, and when Desra reached him, she pressed herself into his embrace with a sob that came from a depth no child should ever have felt. Ironcrest held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, his strong frame trembling with relief and gratitude. Leora watched them with tears warming her eyes. She knew this moment was what Desra had needed, even when fear had clouded everything. The anger she had expected to see in the warrior's face was nowhere. Instead, Ironcrest lifted his gaze to her with a look so full of respect that it eased something heavy inside her. He stood slowly, carrying Desra in his arms as if she were the most fragile treasure in the world. When he stepped closer, Leora didn't retreat. Ironcrest placed a hand over his heart and bowed his head toward her, a gesture of honor in his culture. Then he spoke in his deep, calm voice, thanking her for protecting the piece of his soul he thought he had lost. Leora understood only a few words, but the meaning was clear without translation. The next morning brought a new light to the valley. The storm that had threatened for days never came. Instead, sunlight spilled over the land, warming the adobe walls and chasing away the heavy shadows of fear. The tension that had filled the air finally loosened. Ironcrest stayed near the edge of Leora's land, never crossing without permission. He built a small fire as a peaceful sign, cooking a simple meal and singing low songs from his tribe. Desra sat beside him, listening as if hearing stories from a life she barely remembered. Occasionally, she glanced back at Leora, who was preparing breakfast inside the house, offering her a shy smile of reassurance. Leora felt something healing inside her. She had feared losing the child, but instead she found her heart widening to hold more than she expected. The connection between her and Desra didn't fade. It simply changed shape. The girl began moving between them, as if weaving together to parts of her identity she had been forced to live separately, around midday. A small group of settlers approached cautiously. They expected conflict. But when they saw Ironcrest sitting peacefully with his daughter, and Leora offering coffee to both of them without fear, confusion replaced tension. Leora walked forward and explained everything calmly. She told them Desra was Ironcrest's child, taken during a violent raid months earlier. She told them the warrior had searched for her across dangerous lands, never hurting anyone, never raising a weapon. She told them fear had misled them. No, the truth was something they never allowed themselves to imagine. The settlers lowered their rifles. Some apologized, some looked ashamed, and some simply nodded with relief. Ironcrest rose and walked toward them, placing his hand on his heart as a gesture of peace. The men exchanged glances, then returned the gesture awkwardly, but sincerely. By that evening, everything felt lighter. Leora invited Ironcrest and Desra to share a meal at her table. The adobe house filled with warmth that had been missing for too long. Desra sat between them, smiling more than she had since she arrived. Leora told stories of the valley, about planting herbs and baking bread. Ironcrest shared, through gentle gestures and low words, the stories of his tribe, their ways, their songs, their hopes. Desra listened with a bright spark in her eyes, finally seeing the pieces of her life coming together as the sun set. Ironcrest stepped outside with Leora. He placed a carved pendant in her hand. The same symbol the young Apache woman had brought days earlier. But this one was new, carved by his own hand. It was the shape of a heart held by two hands. He pressed her palm around it and nodded respectfully, thanking her again for saving his daughter when the world had turned harsh. Liora felt tears well again. She didn't need words to understand his gratitude or the meaning of the gift. It was a sign of trust, respect, and connection that would not break with distance. When Ironcrest prepared to return to his tribe, Desra hesitated. She reached for Leora, her small hands shaking with uncertainty. Leora held her close, whispering that love didn't disappear just because paths changed. She assured her that she would always be part of her life. Desra hugged her with all the strength. In her small arms before returning to her father's side, Ironcrest lifted his daughter onto his horse and nodded once more to Leora. The widow stood in the warm glow of sunset, watching them ride toward the horizon, their silhouettes glowing against the fire-colored sky. The sight held beauty and peace, a reminder that love could exist across worlds when hearts were open, as they disappeared into the distance. Leora felt a quiet joy settle over her. Her house was quiet again, but not empty. She felt healing instead of loneliness. She felt gratitude instead of fear. And she felt the deep truth that had carried her. Through the hardest days, sometimes family found you in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes love asked you to be brave enough to let go so something bigger could take root. And sometimes the frontier, harsh as it was, gave back something precious when you least expected it. Weeks later, Leora stood outside admiring the dawn when she saw a figure riding toward her home. Her heart lifted as she recognized Desra's small form waving from horseback, Ironcrest guiding her gently. The widow smiled, knowing the bond between them had not ended. It had simply begun a new chapter. The story of the widow, the Apache warrior, and the lost child became a quiet legend in Red Canyon Valley. A story of courage, understanding, and the kind of frontier love that crossed boundaries of land, culture, and heart. And Leora knew that the home once filled with silence was now forever touched by warmth, loyalty, and a family that lived beyond walls. A story carried by the old American winds, whispering that healing was always possible when hearts chose kindness.